If you've owned a dog long enough or spent any sort of time on social media related to dogs, you'll know that hiking with off-leash dogs is an extremely controversial topic. In today's video, I'm going to be tackling the concept of hiking off-leash with dogs and kind of challenging the rhetoric on why it's so bad. For some background, when I first started hiking with my dogs as an undergraduate student in college, I always kept them on leash. I was very leery of off-leash dogs, I didn't like off-leash dogs, and I felt that dogs should just be on leash all the time. However, after doing herding training with my German Shepherd Prima and learning all about the relationship and bond that you can form with a dog while working, and then going on to hike and through hike thousands of miles together, I began to change my tone and my feelings about off-leash dogs. Over time, I learned that it is in fact possible to have an extremely well-trained and reliable dog off-leash, to the point where I felt comfortable cowboy camping with my dogs out under the stars off leash at night. Even in ditches next to the side of a busy highway, like when we hiked the Western Wanderer route and we're hiking along US Highway 93 in Arizona. With that in mind, I'm going to address some kind of like concerns that people have and why I think dogs should be allowed to hike off leash. So first, I want to talk about the difference between off leash and voice control. I keep using the term off-leash, but that's really not what I'm doing with my dogs. I'm hiking with them under voice control. If you look at any sort of regulations for most national forests, at least in the western US, where dogs are allowed to be quote-unquote off-leash, generally speaking, the regulations don't say off-leash. They say that dogs must be under voice control, or dogs must be under control. They do not say under physical control. That's usually the difference. They do not, however, say that your dog can be off-leash per se. What it's saying is that your dog does not have to be clipped to a leash, but they must still stay with you. They must still respect wildlife. You should still pick up after them. Essentially, even though they're not clipped to a leash, they should still act like they're on a leash. Where I think a lot of people get into trouble is they interpret this as off-leash and that basically their dog can just treat the trails in the forest like it's their own personal dog park. This is what really aggravates a lot of trail users because these dogs are running up to people that really don't want anything to do with them. They're running up to other dogs that are not happy to be around loose leash dogs, and they might even be harassing wildlife. When people have their dog under voice control, they're keeping them close, they're giving other people space. A lot of times, even if I have the right of way, I try to get off the trail and let other people pass so that they don't have to interact with my dog. I know a lot of people will even leash their dog up if they see someone else. I think as long as your dog is close to you and it's obvious that you have them under control, then that's really the important thing here. When I'm hiking with my dogs under voice control, they are not allowed to greet other dogs. They're not allowed to greet other people unless the people ask, and they're definitely not allowed to chase wildlife. Kind of a good rule here is just to assume that nobody wants anything to do with your dog unless they tell you otherwise. So with that in mind, if you're trying to decide whether your dog should be allowed to hike under voice control, it's important to know their breed and know your specific dog. Certain breeds are much easier to train to hike off leash, although it's never a guaranteed bet. For example, breeds that were bred to work as a team with their human partner to complete a job are generally easier to train off leash. That's breeds like a lot of the herding breeds, a lot of the sporting breeds, and so on. Breeds that were bred to work independently on their own without the person really aiding them are generally going to be more difficult to train to be off leash. A lot of the terriers and a lot of the hounds tend to be more difficult to train off leash for this reason, because they were just bred to go on their prey drive and do their thing and kind of disregard the human aspect of that equation. Aside from the breed, it also really depends a lot on the dog's personality. Dogs that are always more concerned with what you're doing, think like Velcro dogs, dogs that follow you to the bathroom, won't let you out of their sight, especially dogs, I hate to say it, that low-key have a little bit of separation anxiety, are the ones that are generally also going to be easier to train off leash. Dogs that could care less where you're going, they like you, you're their person, but they don't need you, that just makes it so much more challenging to train them to be reliable off leash because they don't need to keep you in their sight. Prey drive also can affect this, of course, when you talk about training around wildlife. If they're so focused on prey and chasing that they don't care about anything else in the world, that's going to make it a really big challenge. With those characteristics in mind, some dogs will be extremely easy to train off leash. For example, my German Shepherd puppy has been doing really well with off leash training so far because he's a soft personality, he really cares about where we are, and he's a herding breed, so he's already predisposed to being around us and staying with us. So that makes it a lot easier. Border terriers are better than some other terriers just because they're more interested in their people, But in general, if I got another terrier, say I would love to have another Cairn Terrier someday, I know that they would be much more challenging to train to be off leash. And I would also go into things knowing that there's always a possibility that they might not be able to ever be off leash, even with all the training in the world. That kind of leads me to my next point, which is you need to know yourself as an owner. In my opinion, the biggest issue with off-leash dogs generally isn't the dog, it's the owner. Allowing your dog to hike under voice control is a lot of work. It takes a lot of training and it takes paying attention all the time. You can't ever really take time off to just like go into La La Land in your brain while you're walking. You should really always be watching your dog and paying attention to your surroundings. It takes a lot of added time to train everything, that responsibility piece, and then also just asking yourself, are you willing to use the tools that are necessary for your dog to hike off leash? Some dogs might not ever be able to hike off leash without an e-collar. Is that something you're willing to do? For some people, yes, other people, no. Some dogs don't need that. It really just depends on the dog and what you're willing to put into it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of owners out there that are just completely oblivious to what their dog is doing. They're usually the ones where you're walking along, their dog comes flying up to you, and the first thing out of their mouth is, "Don't worry, my dog's friendly." As someone that has owned slightly reactive dogs in the past, that is like the last thing you want to hear. It doesn't matter if your dog is off leash, if my dog isn't, right? So being aware of that and being aware of your surroundings, going back to what I said earlier, not letting your dog walk up to other people and dogs unless invited, is vital for making sure that everybody has a good experience on the trail. The other thing too is, of course, dogs aren't robots. That's why we love them, right? They're all different. They all have different personalities. Because of that, sometimes dogs have bad days too, right? Maybe they don't listen one day. It's going to happen. It really shouldn't happen very often, if at all, if you're doing your training properly, but it could happen. So what are you going to do about that? Because when I see these people that are just calling out, oh, they're friendly, or calling Fido, 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 and their dog is ignoring them, that is extremely frustrating on the other end. When my dog does something and they don't listen, I'm going to make sure that I go get them so that they do listen, right? So enforcing those boundaries and making sure that they're not just blowing me off and doing whatever they want to do. The moral of the story here is be considerate, be courteous to others, and hold your own dog accountable. The last thing I really want to talk about is please don't intentionally break the rules. That just makes lots of people angry. It makes it harder for the rest of us that are trying to follow the rules. I also find it extremely frustrating when I have extremely well-trained dogs that are well-traveled and I go somewhere and it's an inconvenience to me to follow the rules, but I do it anyways, and then I see somebody else that is not following the rules. On my end, it just feels like that person thinks they're above the law or above the rules, and it's really frustrating when I've had to hold the leash for the last 12 miles and I have a big backpack and my dogs hike different speeds, and then I see somebody whose crazy dog is on a trail with a leash law. So please follow the rules. It makes everyone happier. And if you don't like hiking in places where dogs are required to be on leash, then just don't hike those places. Go somewhere where they can be off leash or under voice control. Generally speaking, I rarely, if ever, hike on trails where there are leash laws, mainly because I just hate dealing with it and my dogs are well trained. So I try to go places where there are voice control laws instead. And when I do go places like on a thru hike, I try to follow the rules as much as possible. You know, if you're scrambling, maybe it's not safe for you to do so, but I try my hardest to try to be a good citizen. In conclusion, if you have something against off-leash dogs, I would bet that the issue isn't the dog, it's the owner not knowing their own dog, not willing to be putting in the work, and not willing to understand the regulations. However, I don't think that means that we should have leash laws everywhere. Because when a dog is really well trained, and it is possible, Prima and Skittles are both proof of that, then it's a really beautiful thing and it's nice to be able to let your dog off leash, especially when you're hiking 3,000 miles across the country with a backpack on. It's nice not to have to deal with that. So I think what we should do is try to focus more on educating people on the differences between voice control and being off leash. We should try to educate people on proper dog behavior and how to interpret their dog's behavior, and also help people with their training. Instead of vilifying people, we should try to educate them, and instead of making blanket laws, we should try to help the people that need the help, right? So that's just my personal opinion. I know it's different for everyone. I know that this is a hot topic and people have different experiences, so please let me know your thoughts below. If you're just here though to make mean comments, I would appreciate it if you would at least make them constructive. But yeah, that's my experience, and hopefully we can help change some people's minds and help educate them so that we have more well-behaved dogs out on the trails.